The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, today we will consider the 61st closed rule of this Congress, part of a disturbing and familiar pattern. Republicans are running this House with no regular order, no hearings on legislation, and one closed rule after another. Speaker Ryan and the House Republicans recently set a record as presiding over the most closed session of Congress in history, and now they are adding to it. With no transparency and their continued effort to silence any debate and any dissent, this chamber feels more like the Russia House rather than the People's House. Now, I know Donald Trump is enthralled with authoritarian rulers and authoritarian rule, but that doesn't mean you guys have to follow suit. Today's rule provides for the consideration of H.R. 4712, yet another partisan and extreme Republican bill that is completely unnecessary and aimed solely at pleasing the majority's right-wing base. The simple truth is that this bill is filled with inflammatory language intentionally designed to politicize women's access to health care. It is clearly about nothing more than advancing an agenda to take away access to safe and legal abortion. With this bill, House Republicans are meddling in the decisions that should be left up to doctors and patients. That is not our job. What we're doing today is not about serious legislating. If it was, you would have gone through regular order. This bill is nothing more than a very cynical effort to give Republican members of Congress something to point to when they join the anti-choice march in Washington this week. Republicans are recklessly playing politics with women's health, and they should be ashamed. My Republican colleagues claim that this bill is just a reinstatement of the current Born Alive law. First, if that were true, then this bill would be redundant and unnecessary. And second, Democrats would support it. When the original law came to the House floor in 2002, it passed by a voice vote. We all agreed. But this bill is not a reinstatement. This bill takes the current functional law and adds a radical inclusion of criminal penalties for doctors if they violate the unreasonable requirements of this legislation. Under current law, when a child is born alive, including during an abortion procedure, the healthcare provider is required to care for this newborn and apply a standard level of care given to any and every child. However, this bill takes the law a step further. It requires that the doctor immediately transport this child to a hospital without exception, whether it is safe for the child or not, or face criminal punishment up to 5 years in jail. This bill could create a chilling effect and limit access to safe legal abortion for women, since physicians may fear prosecution. Patients need and deserve access to compassionate and appropriate medical care, and this bill is, quite frankly, unconscionable. Mr. Speaker, there are times when immediately transporting a newborn to a hospital that may be miles or even hours away may result in grave harm to that infant. Such decisions must be left to the professional judgment of doctors and clinicians. Doctors and clinicians oppose this law because it prevents them from giving the best care to their patients. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists strongly oppose this legislation, calling it, and I quote, gross interference in the practice of medicine, end quote. Current law is working, and it should not be radically changed for a partisan talking point. Right now, there are a number of truly critical issues that we ought to be considering on this floor, not a soundbite for an anti-choice rally coming up in the next couple of days. You know, a clear majority of Americans, I should point out to my colleagues, 7 out of 10, say they believe a woman should have the right to safe legal abortion, according to a Quinnipiac University poll. By stark contrast, fewer than 3 in 10 Americans, that's 29%, approve of the job Republicans are doing in Congress. Maybe you ought to get the hint. People don't like what you're doing. This should be a wake-up call for Republicans to end their partisan crusades and start doing their jobs. It is time to focus on the real pressing issues we face. The Children's Health Insurance Program, CHIP, which nearly 2 million kids and their families rely on, has been in limbo for months as states are beginning to run out of money. Now Republicans are pushing a continuing resolution that fails to permanently extend CHIP. Permanently extending CHIP would not only give these kids and their families the certainty they need when it comes to their health care, but the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office says it would also save $6 billion. I thought you were the party of fiscal responsibility. Do the right thing and you could save $6 billion. But Republicans would rather kick the can down the road once again. The authorizations for community health center funds and maternal, infant, and childhood home visitation programs will remain expired. That's not even included in this partisan CR that we're going to see a little bit later today. Each and every day, 122 dreamers are losing their protected status and ability to work in this country, and my Republican friends don't seem at all bothered by that. People who are first responders, saving lives, people who serve in our military, people who work in our companies, who are such great members of our community, are treated like this in such a rotten way, and yet more inaction. The administration just stripped 200,000 Salvadorans legally residing in the United States of their protected status, people who are obeying our laws, who are working here legally. They did this while admonishing Congress to provide these same people with an enduring lawful immigration status, and yet we have a Congress that is so dysfunctional, you can't even agree on what to have for lunch, never mind move anything forward that's positive with regard to protecting these important members of our community. The debt limit needs to be raised to ensure that the U.S. is able to pay its bills. Communities are urgently in need of resources to fight the opiate epidemic that is killing 91 Americans a day. They're tired of your press releases. They want the funding to be able to respond to the crisis in their communities, and yet nothing in this CR, no urgency here in Congress. And more needs to be done to help repair damage left by devastating wildfires and hurricanes that have ravaged this country. I just came back from a trip to Puerto Rico. The place is still in great disrepair, and our initial response to that hurricane was disgraceful. We have a special obligation to these people, our fellow citizens, to better respond, and yet there's no urgency here. And most importantly, where is the budget agreement that sets the budget caps for fiscal year 2018? House and Senate appropriators can't even begin negotiations on an omnibus funding bill until they know their top-line numbers. That means that this will not be the last short-term continuing resolution that we see before this House. And until there is an agreement on the budget caps, we will continue to see the Republican majority keep kicking the can down the road. We will see CR number 5 in mid-February and maybe CR number 6 and shortly thereafter. When will the Republicans finally stop negotiating with themselves and instead reach out to Democrats and work in a bipartisan way and actually get the job done that we were sent here to do by our constituents? We are just hours away from another Republican shutdown, and instead of working on a bipartisan agreement, we are here discussing this, an inflammatory bill that will impose criminal penalties on doctors and allow Congress to intrude on medical care decisions. When are we going to put the radical rhetoric aside and actually do our jobs and tackle the real issues the Americans sent us here to tackle? And here's kind of the icing on the cake. You know, I mean, this government shutdown is looming. You know, we're going to run out of money on Friday. All hell's going to break loose if we can't come to some sort of agreement. You would think we'd all be working together to get this thing done as quickly as possible. But then we're told we're going to consider the continuing resolution rule after this, and then we're going to debate it, but we're not going to vote on it until later tonight, after 7, maybe even later. Why? People might ask. Are we delaying action on a bill that decides whether we keep the government open? Oh, we just found out. President Trump is doing a political rally with Republican members of Congress in Pennsylvania. So the political rally is more important than the well-being of the American people? What are you guys thinking? Shame on you. I mean, this is a moment of urgency, and instead of doing political soundbite legislation, and instead of doing political rallies in Pennsylvania for an election that doesn't happen until March, members of Congress ought to be here working to keep the government running, to come to some sort of accommodation on the Dreamers, to make sure community health centers are funded, to make sure our veterans get the funding and the health care that they need. This is atrocious what you are doing. If the American people could sue you for political malpractice, you would be in deep trouble. I urge my colleagues to oppose this rule, to oppose this bill that would severely undermine women's access to essential services like abortion. And I urge my colleagues to cancel the political rally and get back to work. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from